In this video, we will start our discussion of ERD or ER diagrams. Now, we said earlier that the conceptual schema will provide the overall detailed structure of the data. We also said it's technology independent and it's going to describe the data content and structure accurately. Now, the ER model is a logical representation of the data for an organization or a business area. It will use entities for data categories and relationships for associations between those entities. The ER diagram or ERD is a graphical representation of an entity relationship model. Now, the ERD is a data modeling tool. It will depict the association among different categories of the data. However, it does not imply how to implement, how to create, update, or delete the data. It consists of three main parts: entities, which are the tables eventually going to be our entities. So we have customer entity and order entity. We also have attributes, which are the attributes that we are trying to collect about each entity. In this case, for customer, we're looking at customer ID, name, address, phone number, birthday, and registration date. And finally, we have relationships, which tells us what is the relationship between those entities. So in this case, customers will place orders, and we will see what those symbols mean later on. So the circle and the bars and what we call a crowfoot here, everything will have a meaning in the ERD. Now, the notation, there is no industry standard that is going to tell us that this is the only way to draw your ERD, but we will use the commonly used notation, which is the following. So these are going to be the entity types, and then the attributes are going to be laid out in a certain way. And these are how we model our relationships, and this is what we call the cardinality. We will dive into each one in more details. There are different tools that are going to help you draw this. So we have MS Visio, Smart Draw, Oracle Designer, and others, including online tools. Now, for simplicity for this course, I will be using this online tool. You are very welcome to use it as well. It's an easy tool to use. There are many tutorials online on how to use this, and it's very intuitive to use. Now, let's start talking in details about entities. An entity can be a person, can be a place, an object, and so on. So the definition of entity is a collection that have common characteristics or properties, such as students, employees, books, vehicles, and everything that will have common characteristics or properties, and we want to model this in our database that is going to be specific to that organization we're working with. And this is a way how to model the entity along with the attributes. Now, there is another way to model the entity without the attributes, as we will see in upcoming slides. Now, an entity instance is an entry or an occurrence of an entity type. So in this case, the student is the entity type. So the type of the entity is student, and each one of those records is what we call an entity instance. So again, the main entity, which is the entity type, is student, and then this is one instance, this is another instance, third instance, and then the fourth instance in this case. So how do we define entities? What should be an entity and what should not be an entity? Let's first start with what should be an entity. Any object that will have many instances in our database is an entity. Those instances will have multiple attributes, and we are trying to model those attributes in our database. So there will be some instances with multiple attributes, but we do not want to model them in the database. So they don't mean anything to the business we're trying to model, and this is not going to be an entity in that specific problem. Now, what should not be an entity? A single database user cannot be an entity, although the single database user will have multiple attributes, and we're trying to model that in our database, but that user is not going to have its separate entity. So, for example, if I say I have one single database administrator, that administrator will have a name, will have a birth date, and will have many attributes, but it's a single user, so we will not have many instances, so we cannot have that as an entity. The other thing is any database system output, such as data reports. So if I want to generate an annual report out of my profit, let's say, this will not be an entity because the data is already in the database. And what we need to do is we will just run some kind of code, and based on that code, we will eventually get some results. And those results will not be stored permanently in the database. Every time we can just run that code and generate the report, and that's why we don't need an entity for that. Now let's look at an example. So this example is talking about expense management system example, and it says we have a treasurer that manages the company's accounts. The treasurer will enter the data about the company, such as account IDs, responsible personnel, description, and so on. Each account can have various expense transactions that need to be saved, containing the date and time and amount and description. And the treasurer will receive reports at regular intervals that will summarize the data from those expenses. So what are the entities in this case? Now we need to think about multiple instances, having multiple attributes, and we want to model those in our problem, and we need to exclude single users. So now we have two possible ERDs, the top one and the bottom one. So the top one says, okay, the treasurer is an entity, and the expense report is another entity, account is an entity, and expense is another entity. Now the second ERD says, no, we only need account and we only need expense. So in this case, which one is right and why? Let's look closely at these two. Which one conforms to what should be an entity and what should not be an entity? So in this case, the bottom one is the right ERD. Why is it the right ERD? Because first of all, treasurer, as we mentioned, we have only one treasurer, so we don't have multiple instances, so this cannot be an entity. On the other hand, expense report is computed whenever we need it. So this is going to be a system-generated report, and for system-generated reports, we don't create entities as well. Now let's talk about entity types. So we have, first of all, what we call a strong entity type. It will have its own unique identifier, which is an attribute or possibly a combination of attributes that will uniquely distinguish each occurrence of that entity. So for example, if I say my entity type is student, the unique identifier for student is going to be student ID, for example, because we will have a unique student ID for every instance in that entity type. This will exist independently of other types or entities. Examples, students, employee, vehicle, all of those can exist in the database without the need of other entity to rely on. On the other hand, we have weak entity type. Now, this cannot exist on its own. It will have to depend on a strong entity in order for it to exist. This will not have a unique identifier, but will have a partial identifier, and it will be denoted by double line in the ERD. We will see an example in a moment, but let's think of an example of a strong entity and a weak entity. A good example would be employee and dependent. So the employee is a strong entity. It can exist in our system without having to have another entity. But on the other hand, a dependent will have to have an employee in the system so the dependent would exist. So for example, if I say John is an employee in the company, I can just go ahead and place John's name in my table. But then if I say, okay, we have, let's say, Mary, who is the wife of Bob, but Bob is not an employee in my company. Can I have Mary as a dependent? If I place Mary as a dependent, then whose dependent is Mary? And that means this is a weak entity. Now, if John has a son or a wife or a daughter, then in that case, I can place that person in the dependent table because it is going to totally rely on having an employee instance in my database.